Hi, this is Michelle DePalma. I work for Red Hat. I'm in the Cloud Storage and Data Services BU, and recently I have been doing a lot of work with the Multicloud Object Gateway. So I will give you an overview of MCG because I'm going to assume that you know nothing about it, and we're going to touch on the different kinds of buckets that OCG will offer you, and then I really want to get into something called Namespace Buckets, and I will show you a demo, and I will talk over the demo and try and highlight certain features of it, and then we'll kind of come back and hopefully have a Q&A and maybe get some polls done and stuff like that. So first, your overview. The Multi-Cloud Object Gateway is a high-level data service. It's lightweight, and it enables object data access and flow to different buckets across different resources, hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, but it's done based on bucket policy. So before I continue, I just wanted to mention that I find that everything that MCG offers you, every feature that comes up, really falls into one of these three categories below. So it's either making something more flexible or across multiple backends, remember we're always talking about multi-cloud, or it's giving you a more consistent experience everywhere, or it's simplifying the management of siloed data. Often it's doing more than one of these things, but when you see the different object buckets that I'm going to show you that MCG offers, I will be able to point out, oh, see, this makes this more flexible, this makes this more simple, this is part of the consistent experience. So it helps me to think about where these buckets fall within these three things: flexible, consistent, and simplified. I also wanted to mention that upstream name for this product is Nuba. I don't actually show the Nuba icon anywhere else, so I just wanted to get it in here. So to begin with, I'm going to break out the objects that are offered by MCG into three categories. I think it's helpful to think of them in these three categories. So the first one is what MCG would call a storage object bucket, just an object bucket. And really, these are concerned with data safety. So when I say data safety, I'm talking about mirroring, I'm talking about doing a spread. Of course, this is across different data resources, right? Where a data resource here would be Azure, or would be Red Hat Ceph on-prem somewhere, or maybe AWS in another cloud, that kind of thing. You can mirror across them. You can also spread. And honestly, this entire topic deserves its own talk. There's deduplication. There's all kinds of good stuff that happens here, and I'm not really going to touch on it. So if you want to know more, definitely reach out. We can show you some demos and do some presentations based on data safety object bucket stuff that's offered by MCG. Okay, so the next kind of bucket that I'm just going to briefly touch on are the dynamic buckets that are created. This is inside your cluster. So OVC, Object Bucket Claims, are going to dynamically create object buckets for you. And I will touch on why you might want to get into these inside your cluster in a couple of slides. So my favorite feature from MCG, as I'm sure the moderators all know, is Namespace Buckets. And to me, this is straight up data federation. Really, if you come from a database world, this will be very familiar to you, extremely powerful and flexible, and that is primarily what I'm going to be talking about, and it's what I'll be talking over in my recorded demo. So getting into the storage buckets offered by MCG. Okay, so again, this is concerned with data safety. So you can think of these buckets as having three types, right? You're either going to do multi-cloud, which is going to be, as it sounds, across two clouds, or you can do the very, very typical and common hybrid cloud, right? So that's probably massive on-prem, and then something up in AWS or Azure or something like that, and then multi-site, where you're really just talking about different data centers, always familiar to everyone. So when you start talking about everything in MCG, you really have to kind of first start talking about data resources. And by data resource, here, I mean identifying who you're communicating with. Let's take AWS as an example. So I need to know that my data resource is in AWS. I need to know my credentials, and I need to know my target bucket name. Some version of that's going to be true whether I'm talking to Azure, whether I'm talking to some other S3 endpoint in one of my other data centers, but a data resource is going to be all of the information I need to establish a connection to that other remote resource somewhere. So everything MCG is about, you're going to pull together a virtual bucket, right? And then you're going to say, I want the following resources to be included in this bucket. And you get a ton of flexibility about what those resources are and how you connect to them. And then once you pull together that bucket with the resources in it, you then get to say, I want to mirror that across these two resources. As an example, we could say, AWS and on-prem. I want to do a mirror across them. And then you can even tier it. So let's say you're really, really, really concerned about data safety, or let's say you're like someone like me who's been through quite a lot of weekend migrations with the storage team, and you know you have some sort of big change coming up, and you want to be able to say, okay, I'm going to mirror between these two resources down here, but I want to add a third, and I'm going to give it time for the mirror to complete, and then I'm going to drop one of the data resources in my mirror. So everything around the mirroring and the spread for these kinds of buckets is about flexibility. Your users, your developers, are still going to talk to the same endpoint. They're still going to talk to the same bucket from their point of view. But you, as a storage admin, get to have tremendous flexibility about what's included, how are you going to treat, if you're going to mirror it or spread it, all kinds of, and you can, and the tiering. I actually find the tiering is for the ultra paranoid, right? Like if you're really worried, you can say I've got, I'm going to mirror across these two resources, and then I'm going to layer another mirror on top. So tons of flexibility here, really very consistent experience for your developers. So again, there's way more about this that can be talked about. We can talk about deduplication and how that's handled. We can talk about details about how spreading is handled, but that's really its own whole conversation, and I would love to have a separate chat about that. Okay, so next up, another favorite, the OVC bucket. So inside of your cluster, this is part of the consistent experience thing, I think, and flexibility, I would say. So when you think about OVC, object bucket claims, I would say they really parallel PVCs and PVs. There's one nice advantage from the object side, which I'll talk about. So as a developer, you're going to create an object bucket claim, and what MCG is going to do for you is create the bucket that goes with it. So that sounds really simple, but the nice thing about it is that you also get all the credentials you need to access that bucket in a config map. So this is very workload, OpenShift specific focus, and it actually, I use these in my own demos all the time because I don't have to worry about cleanup afterwards. I don't have to deal with credentials. I know I'm going to get them in maps, and we're just going to map them into environment variables. Remember, these are buckets. We're not mounting anything into the pod. We're talking to an endpoint. So to be able to say to a group of developers in maybe their staging or test environment, hey, just do OVCs, don't worry about cleanup, it'll delete itself after it's done, would actually be a really wonderful thing. So to me, this is about consistency, experience, and flexibility from the storage admin side. I just say, this is how you make an object bucket claim, let them play with it, and I'm off to doing other stuff. So again, this could have its own talk, and I actually do have a photo album demo that I can share with you at the very end. You can pull it down from GitHub and try it yourself and see OVCs in action. Okay, my favorite, namespaces. Okay, namespace buckets from MCG are data federation. If you've worked with databases and done any sort of views and federated tables, this should be very familiar to you. So if you haven't, let me just give you a quick overview of what that means. In the case of databases, as well as in the case of buckets, you will have to define underlying resources, which we've already talked about for all of the other buckets we just discussed, right? So you're going to say, where am I connecting to? What are my credentials? What's the target bucket? So you pull them together into this virtual namespace bucket, and you're going to see an aggregated view of everything. So it's really important to remember that in the case of namespace buckets, nothing's moving. This is not replication, this is not mirroring. Everything's actually staying put, but you as the storage admin get to decide what is in this view, what is not in this view. And you also get to decide where rights go. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this particular problem because it's larger than you think. And I talk to more and more customers who have some version of this problem. So we know that they're using multiple clouds. We definitely see hybrid where it's like, as I think I said before, massive on-prem data stores, and then maybe a little bit in AWS or other clouds, and they're kind of spread out. And one day everything seems organized and they're in control of it, and 2 months later they're looking at so many data stores that they actually can't even keep track of it. Even the management of all of these siloed data stores is becoming an issue. So in particular, MCG in general, but MCG namespace buckets are really trying to address this issue here, where you see all of these buckets popping up in different places, right? You definitely don't want to see customers managing all of their data stores with sheets, keeping track of credentials and things like that. So we have to do a little bit better than that, and MCG absolutely answers that. This demo is going to talk about federation in particular, and it's going to use a Jupyter notebook, and it's actually a COVID spread example, which I'll go through in the next slide what that is. But as we flow through, you'll see it's Jupyter notebook running an Open Data Hub. All of this is inside of OpenShift, and then it flows down into Open Data Foundation. But we're going to go through the Multicloud Object Gateway through a namespace bucket, and the entire purpose of this demo is to show you that from the point of view from the developer, it's just an S3 bucket. It doesn't look different. It doesn't react differently. Everything is the same. The developer has no idea that underneath I might have a AWS read-write bucket and several other read-only buckets coming from multiple providers. Okay, a slight note about this particular notebook. I did not write this notebook. I just modified it. It's supposed to have like a data scientist kind of point of view. So this is a COVID-19 mapping spread example. It's a very, very simple image generator, and it represents a heat map done on a daily basis. So this source, the data originally comes from Johns Hopkins, and the input data is just a bunch of CSV files. Every line is from each country, and it has all kinds of different totals. And the output is just a heat map per day. This is what the Jupyter Notebook actually looks like, and that's an example of like day one when I first started. Here it is a little bit bigger in case it was too small before. So in this demo, I end up switching a lot between my Jupyter Notebook and the OpenShift console and the MCG console, which has not been fully integrated yet. Okay, so here, there are a ton of cells in here. There are really only two that matter. This one up here, there it is, Bodo 3. Absolutely, positively normal S3 bucket. I'm going to read from it, I'm going to process this data, and then I'm going to write to it. So I start the kernel, it starts doing its thing, and I'm going to flip over to the OpenShift. So, okay, so I am running, actually not even the latest and greatest OCS operator. I think there's a newer one for that. But as I mentioned before, the Multicloud Object Gateway console is not fully integrated yet, so I do have to actually click over into it. I'm not going to see all of the information I need, but that is, of course, being worked on. So here I highlight, you're in the Object Service tab, dashboard, and we're just going to click to the Multicloud Object Gateway. Okay, so this is the NUBA Multicloud Object Gateway dashboard. Some repetition here between what you see in OpenShift dashboards in this, but that's okay. And we're going to end up going down to buckets first. There we go. I'm clicking on buckets. And we're talking namespace buckets. So here, this is the bucket I actually use in the demo. And what's important in this page is to start to see how policy gets handled inside of MCG. So some of the things you expect to see, S3 access control, triggers on the bucket, all of that's normal. So what's unique here is the data placement part. So I have defined two data resources, GCP MCG Bucket 9 and AWS MCG Bucket 7. And as you can see there, it's got, the top one has read and write on it, and the second one has read. So I actually, those are my data resources. I'm pulling them into this bucket, and I'm assigning what's going to happen when you go to read from this bucket or write to it. Here I add an extra one. So now I'm looking at 3 data resources. Nothing has changed as far as my S3 bucket goes. Nothing has changed as far as the data scientist writing to this endpoint doesn't know any better. I can flip-flop these around, which I do actually. Here I'm going to show you a little more detail about each namespace resource because I think it's important to see. Here they are. They're all coming from different providers. I did not include an internal provider, but I could have, right? I'm running Rook staff. I can certainly include an endpoint there as well. So underneath namespace resources, I can go and use an existing connection, but just choose a different bucket. Or I can define a new connection. Maybe it's to AWS, maybe it's another one to Azure, but I can certainly define a new connection as well. So I just wanted to give you a sense of the flexibility around the different namespace resources and how they're going to pull together to create your namespace bucket. Okay, so at this point, my notebook has run, and here it is. Here's the last cell, and I'm again just showing you that this is a regular upload file. Nothing special is being done here. These are fully S3 compatible buckets. Felt I needed to drive that point home to make sure people felt comfortable with it. So I believe at this point I am going to restart this cell so that you can see it in action. And then I'm going to change the underlying resources while it's writing out. So right now I have 2. Highlight these 2. I go into edit placement policy. Here we see our policy. This is where the flexibility comes in and simplicity of management. I go back, I start it. It's already starting to write to the MCG bucket, namespace bucket. I change something, I acknowledge that it's been changed, and I go back. It's still writing. There's been no interruption. I even do it again because I actually had enough time to flip it around a few more times. So I go ahead and do that. So again, this is when we talk about lazy migration, this is where these things kind of come in. So, maybe you have this kind of namespace bucket set up, and for some reason you need to change where the rights go. So you go ahead and you add them in, and then the rights start going to the new place. So pretty much that's what this demo shows. If you look at the full video, I have all of the nice world images with the heat maps at the very end, and I'll certainly put a link to that video at the end of this presentation. So, but I just wanted to make sure you understood how seeing it in action. I'm writing to this S3 endpoint, I'm changing data resources underneath, I'm changing my placement policy, and there's no interruption, not even a blip. This slide is about giving you a sense of the different buckets and how they kind of come into play. So as you come in from the top, you're an app, either you're external or you're internal, you can see that basically these two kinds of buckets that you're going to use. So on the view side, on the namespace bucket side, we're talking about something that's read-centric, and data does not move, and you have a single endpoint view. So when I talk to customers about this, I'm thinking of those customers that have tons of data that they cannot replicate, lots of different places for this data. Maybe they have buckets that vendors write to, and they really can't change it. They've got to leave that storage in place. They've got to leave access to it in place. They can't move it and then contact 57 vendors about where they're going to change their stuff. So a lot of namespace buckets fit that scenario very, very nicely. And then on the other side, we have the kind of storage and manage stuff. So data safety, I need to make sure this is mirrored. I want to mirror it, and I want to be able to change that mirror underneath. I want to do a spread, and I want to be able to change who's involved in the spread and where it happens. I also want to give my developers, dynamic buckets that get created on the fly. I don't want to have to deal with credentials all the time. So I'm managing this storage. I'm managing it inside my cluster. I'm managing it for external endpoints as well. More balanced read writes, lots of data tiering to deal with data safety issues. And as you can see on both columns, single endpoint both times. So similar experience, consistent experience in both cases.